There's a little bit of a debate in Catholic circles about what to do with the holiday of Halloween. And by the holiday, I mean, of course, the secular holiday. Going around, getting treats, dressing up in costumes. And there's a lot of Catholics that feel like we should probably just get rid of the whole thing because there's a lot to be condemned about it from a Catholic perspective. But it's also true that Halloween is a Catholic holiday. And I mean that in the literal sense of the word holiday, which was holy day. It was a feast day of the church for as long as anyone can remember. And in fact, the vigil of All Saints' Day, which of course is Halloween, the vigil of the feast is as old as the feast itself. So it's quite possible that, indeed, the vigil of All Saints goes back to the first millennium. And we're talking very, very ancient, over 1,000 years of history that All Saints and its vigil day has been celebrated within the church. So what happened? Well, it's a long story, and I haven't nailed down all the particulars of it yet, but what I think has happened to Halloween is that it remained a holy day of the church. It remained a liturgical day, really up until the Reformation, when, beginning with the Reformation and the ensuing Protestant governments that took a dim view of many of the holy days, especially those that directly affected the controverted doctrines between Protestants and Catholics. So, the intercession of the saints was a big one, of course. So All Saints' Day was kind of, it was a little bit questionable already from a Protestant perspective. So there was legislation passed against it in England, and certainly the government didn't really, and the Protestant state church, the Church of England, didn't really take a really good view of these folk customs, even though they continued in various parts of England really up until the 20th century. And I'm thinking of souling and other folk customs that were part of the Catholic holiday that survived down the centuries. But I think that was the first blow. It was Protestantism. And what I think really started to kill it was a couple of more things that by the time we get to the 20th century, of course, America becomes ascendant as a political power, and American Protestantism is affected by a very dissenting, a very low church form of Protestantism as compared to, say, England. England had the Church of England, which was, out of all of the Protestant denominations, it's one of the most high church. It's basically the most Catholic form of Protestantism that you can have. But in America, you had other forms. You had Baptists, and they were very prominent here in America to a greater degree than they were in England. And I think that like the Calvinists in New England, even worse, they didn't even allow Christmas in New England for a long time. And it was only, I think, with the Irish in Boston that really Christmas comes back. But there was a kind of a lowest common denominator Protestantism in America, which I think really began to really chip away at these folk customs. And you had people coming over here, like the Irish, who still had close connection with Catholicism, but the culture, I think, was by and large not amenable toward preserving Catholic customs. And what happened in America? Well, I think there was greater and greater secularization as the churches in America began to fragment, as you began to have these disparate kinds of Protestantisms go their own way, fundamentalism, high church, Anglicanism. They all went their kind of the separate ways, Calvinism. Then you didn't really have a common language anymore, a way of celebrating anymore, and Christianity became very, very dilute. It became very lowest common denominator, really. So that tended to, I think, really kill any vestige of folk customs that we had in America. And I I think that the death blow, however, to Halloween was probably dealt by the Catholic Church itself. And why do I say that? Well, because in 1955, the Vigil of All Saints' Day was suppressed. Now, people know that there was a Novus Ordo Missae promulgated in 1970. There was a new Mass. But there were changes, there were liturgical changes that had been happening throughout the 1960s. So in 1965, there was liturgical changes. There was 1962, there were liturgical changes. And all the way back as early as 1955, you started to get liturgical changes already creeping in Holy Week and vigils and octaves. So that's what happened in 1955. Halloween was one of the first liturgical holidays to go. So I think the church really, well, I should say some prelates in the church and some currents within the church were allowed to have their way and effectively destroyed Halloween as a Catholic holiday. And to the degree that nobody really celebrates it now, not Novus Ordo Catholics and not even traditional Catholics, because by and large they're using the books of 1962, and the books of 1962 do not have the Vigil of All Saints' Day in them. You have to go back to the books pre-1955. It's pretty well just been cut loose from its anchor in the liturgy, Halloween has, and just allowed to just drift across and pick up whatever folk customs and whatever dumb things that the culture is doing nowadays. It just kind of absorbs it. So that's pretty much the situation we're facing. So a number of Catholics, understandably, are saying, well, we should get rid of the whole thing, because it's become thoroughly paganized, and a lot of people just see what it has become, and they're like, well, we should just not celebrate it. We should not participate in it whatsoever. I am very much of the opposite mind. I think that we should not only celebrate it, but reclaim it from everything that's gone wrong with it and continue what it used to be. And in order to do that, we have to go back. We have to go back before 1955, figure out what Halloween was. And then that will give us a base on which we can move forward on and say, okay, well, this is what it was. What is the essence of this holiday as Catholics celebrated it for 1,000 years? And once we have that base in place, then we can go forward from there and say, well, what does the modern holiday have? We have to deal with the reality of Halloween, of secularized Halloween now. But we can deal with it in a particularly Catholic way. So, what I want to do in this series, this is just kind of an introduction to lay it all out, but what I want to do in this series is I'm envisioning 3 discussions that we're going to have. The first one is going to be going back to the liturgy and figuring out what was Catholic Halloween like. We're going to just forget about the stuff that happened after 1955 and really the stuff that happened after the Reformation. I'm just interested in what does pre-Reformation Halloween look like from a liturgical standpoint, because we want to go back to the liturgy because that's where all the folk customs and all of that, that's where all of them were anchored in, and that's what all of them took root from. So if we begin to understand that, then we can move forward from there. Okay, that's the first thing that we want to deal with, is the liturgical origins of Halloween. The second thing that I want to address is the modern deformation of the holiday, and what can we do about it? All right, what is there that we can do about it? I mean, we have this problem with the modern holiday that it's being used for all sorts of things that we as Catholics cannot really abide. We can't tolerate, whether it's paganism or neo-paganism, Wicca, sexy costume this and sexy costume that, immodesty. And then the third thing that we want to deal with is how do we, after having gotten a sense of the liturgy, after having gotten a sense of how we deal with the modern holiday, how do we rekindle our folk devotions to the holiday? Like where do we go from here? All right, and we're not just reacting to what's going on in the cultural sense in Halloween, but we're building something new. We want to, as Catholics, we want to build a culture We want to put the holiday back together again the way it was, before all of this nonsense with secularism and people that were just trying to undermine the holiday and make it into something it's not. So those are really the three prongs of attack that we're going to take in this series. This is just an introduction, but stick with me for the next installment as we look into the liturgy of Halloween. What does the liturgy of October the 31st? What did that look like in the church?